those definitions across state government. Oh, thank you for starting the recording. I just should have forgot that we hadn't done that yet. So I think we'll have to answer the question of whether we want to standardize the definition, or if maybe it does make sense to use different definitions in different contexts. So that's a key question we'll be addressing. So with that, I'm going to now dive into talking about what the definition is. And again, if at any point any task force members have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and speak up. So the current definition in the Environmental Justice Act has multiple components, and we're going to break them down together in just a moment. But the way that we sort of group those components together is in three categories, just so it's easier to think about. The first are demographic factors, which include race, income, and housing cost burden. The second is what we paraphrase as communities with a history of environmental racism. And I'll just read out kind of the full text there that is in the law, because I think it's important to have that for context. So it's any other community as identified or approved by a state agency if the community has a history of environmental racism perpetuated through redlining, anti-Indigenous, anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic, or anti-Black laws. So we'll be talking more about that later, but I just want to make sure everyone has that context for what we're talking about when we refer to communities with a history of environmental racism. The third component is another one that we paraphrase as cumulative impacts. And so I'm also going to read that aloud because I think there's a lot that goes into that paraphrasing. So it is, again, any other community identified or approved by a state agency if the community is one where multiple factors, including socioeconomic stressors, disproportionate environmental burdens, vulnerability to environmental degradation, and lack of public participation may act cumulatively to affect health and the environment and contribute to persistent disparities. So that was a mouthful. We're going to break all of those down together, but I just wanted to kind of help everyone contextualize what we're talking about with those three different components of the definition. And of course, you can always read the full definition in the Environmental Justice Act. It's also in the scope of work document that we made available for you, the first full task force meeting that's available on the Google Drive. Okay, so now taking our deep dive into the demographic components of the definition. This is, there are again three factors. One thing I want to highlight is that the Environmental Justice Act also provides a geographic scope when it talks about these demographic factors, which is the census block group level. For those of you who don't geek out over census data every day, the census kind of it has three levels of analysis at the federal level. One is county level. Then within counties, there are multiple census tracts, or at least within most counties. Some smaller counties actually only have one. So census tract is that intermediate level. And then most places go down even further down to the neighborhood level of census block groups. So those are kind of the smallest areas. You can think of it as a neighborhood level measure. And for the most part, that is the most granular level that we're able to get data geographically. So that's the geographic scope that is prescribed by the Environmental Justice Act. So there are three demographic components identified in the Environmental Justice Act. The first is income. So census block groups where more than 40% of households are low income, which the Environmental Justice Act defines as the household is at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. Second, the Environmental Justice Act has more than 40% minority households. That's been a bit of a confusing term. It's not defined in the statute. And of course, if you're thinking about an area where people of color are more than 40% of the population, it's very likely that people of color are actually the majority, not a minority in that area. And for that reason and others, I think one of the questions that we'd like to pose for you all is whether the legislature could choose a better term, and that should be revised to potentially just say people of color or some other metric of race. The way that we have been interpreting the term minority as the Environmental Justice Unit and CDPHE is that it means people of color. So we've been using a metric of any person who identifies as anything other than non-Hispanic white. So building in both, as in Census Bureau terms, metrics of race and ethnicity. And then finally, there's more than 40% housing cost burdened households. That is defined by the Environmental Justice Act as a household that spends more than 30% of its monthly income on housing costs. So that is some complicated information, but this is actually the simplest part of the definition for us to understand because it is all information that's sort of already available and data that we have from the US Census Bureau. So we have actually made two tools available that display all of the census block groups that meet that definition in Colorado. The first is the Climate Equity Data Viewer, and the second is the Draft Data Viewer for Disproportionately Impacted Communities. So I believe that Lumna is going to share links to those in the chat, and I am actually going to call each of these up on my screen, which just quick thumbs up, you can see the map. Okay, great. And I'm going to do a little bit of a how to use guide because I think it's sort of helpful to understand sort of the differences between the two tools. And let's see if someone can get links in the chat. I would appreciate it while I'm talking so that you all can follow along at home too. Oh, sorry, they are in the chat. I was looking in the wrong place. I appreciate it. Okay, so this is the data viewer for disproportionately impacted communities in Colorado. The only thing on this map this map only shows census block groups that meet the demographic components of the definition, race, income, and housing cost burden. That's all that's displayed here. You can see that areas that are low income show up in brown, people of color, the 40% minority population component shows up in blue, housing cost burden is in teal, and then purple areas are more than one category. This is maybe not the most user-friendly map, so I will just give that caveat. We've kind of decided to invest our mapping resources in our more permanent tools since this is a temporary tool. But I want to make sure that everyone knows kind of just how to use it so that we can make the most of it while we're using this temporary tool. We'll talk more about our replacement tools in a moment. So I'm going to just zoom in here on Otero County, Southeast Colorado, and shout out to my own grandparents. We've all been talking about relationships with our families, but that's where they lived for pretty much their whole lives. So we're going to zoom in here on Lahana, and you can see that there are multiple areas within Ontario County and even within the city of Lahana that show up on the map, right? And each kind of line here represents a different census block group. So some of the areas meet the definition because they're low income, which you can see when you hover your cursor over this area just kind of east of Lahana shows up as being about 60% low income and 30% housing cost burden, 38% people of color. Some of the census block groups within the city limits show up as more than one category in purple. So we'll take a moment to load, but I just clicked on this one. It is 80% people of color in North Lahana and 65% low income, almost 40% housing cost burden. So that's an area that meets multiple parts of the definition. If you click on the map, you can also see that data sort of displayed down below. And if you want to unclick and you want to select another area, sort of be able to scroll around again, and just click an area that doesn't meet the definition or use the home key. So the nice part about this map is that it does show you the reason why each census block group meets the definition. But again, it's not super user-friendly. So if you kind of just want to see, a spectrum, or you're like, well, that's interesting, I wonder why that part of Otero County meets the definition, then you can zoom in there. But we have a more user-friendly map that also has other information on it. So if you're kind of looking for other purposes, it may be more useful. And that's the Climate Equity Data Viewer. So the Climate Equity Data Viewer has a lot of information on it. It's our sort of current best environmental justice mapping tool. And it does have the same information built in. So if you go to the funnel in the top right corner, this icon here where my mouse is, you can click on the disproportionately impacted communities data layer, and you can kind of see that the same areas show up, all the same census block groups that were in the other map. So I'm going to zoom back in on Otero County here. You can see all the same areas, but you can see a different color scheme is used. So the colors in the Climate Equity Data Viewer are actually showing you the climate equity score, which is a combined metric of different environmental exposures, demographic factors, other factors that lead to an overall calculation of sort of environmental burden that differs also at the census block group level. And when you click on a census block group, you can see that it gives you a lot of information about sort of how the climate equity score was calculated, sort of overall percentile ranking based on population characteristics and environmental burdens. But it doesn't tell you why a specific block group meets the definition under the Environmental Justice Act. So it doesn't sort of break it out by race or income or housing cost burden. One thing that you can do is you can actually search this map by address. So I'm just going to type in my grandparents' address here. So I can just type that in and zoom in, see their home in Lahana. Because I have that disproportionately impacted communities data layer highlighted, I can also see that it is in a census block group that meets that definition, disproportionately impacted communities. These areas that are not highlighted right now because I have that layer on do not meet the definition. All right, well, that's kind of the demonstration of the current tool. Are there any other questions about that, how to use these two existing tools before I move on? Ian, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm curious, and maybe this is coming next, but that historical redlining component, how is that represented in these kind of maps?
That is a great question, and we have not yet mapped that. So that's one of the things we're working on, and you're right, I'm going to get to that in just a moment. So
I had a question too. Just going back to the definition where you all where it kind of talks about more than 40% low income or housing burdened. Does this map, and you may have showed it, but does this map break down by affordability?
you know, it doesn't. It just has that metric of housing cost burden, which is just a question of whether at least 40% of the households in that census block group spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. So that's the only metric. Yeah.
Okay, but it's broken down in that census though.
Like yeah, that's right. So so just for example, I'm gonna exit back out of the slideshow. So just for a quick example, I'll come up here to actually one area that shows up in the map under housing cost burden is Aspen and parts of the Roaring Fork Valley. So there are multiple census block groups in Pitkin County where more than 40% of the population spends more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So they show up here under the housing cost burden category, right? But we'll come over here to Buena Vista. You can see that there's a census block group that is both housing cost burdened and over 50% low income. So some areas are both low income in terms of the overall income of the population and also housing cost burden. Other areas just show up under that housing cost burden factor.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, great. So I'm going to actually, okay, go back to sharing my screen here. Sorry for that tech pause. So those are the demographic components of the definition. That's kind of what we've done to identify them so far. So now to Ian's point, what are we doing to identify communities with a history of environmental racism? So we have not been able to map those yet because, as you might guess, that information takes more time to gather, right? It's not just information that the Census Bureau puts out at the block group level already for the whole country. So we have been fortunate to hire an intern, who's Tova, who is here with us today, who has been conducting historical research on communities throughout Colorado to identify the communities where there were those categories of historic policies that resulted in essentially residential segregation. So again, the categories of policies that are called out in the Environmental Justice Act are redlining. So I see the redlining map of Denver there on your screen, as well as anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-Hispanic, and anti-immigrant policies. So Tova's really been doing an amazing job in her research so far. She's actually completed her research on Denver and Colorado Springs and has moved on to Pueblo, and will be starting to work on some other cities and rural areas over the next few months. Our kind of target for completion of that secondary source research is in May. At that point, we're going to work on convening a public forum with some expert sort of historians from around the state who are experts in kind of each of those different categories and of types of discriminatory laws and policies, and kind of present what we've found so far through the secondary source research, talk about it with historians, and then really ask the public to give us some input, because we know that just through secondary source research, we're not going to find all of the examples of these laws and policies across Colorado, and that a lot of that information really lives with communities through their lived experience. And I think that's especially true when you think about things like residential segregation and exclusionary zoning laws, that often the laws that are on the books are, that could be documented in the history books, they might not say expressly something like redlining. That's the most obvious example, right? That said, we're going to give different benefits in terms of federal mortgages to different people based on their race, essentially, in which neighborhoods they live in. Many types of exclusionary zoning laws are kind of more subtle, right? It's saying, well, we'll put all of the high density housing in this part of town and not allow multifamily housing in another part. So we're not going to find all of the examples through our research, but we really do hope that all of you can help us out through connections with your own community and publicizing this forum once we have it ready, to really reach out to your communities and help us understand what we're missing from people's lived experience, make sure that we kind of set up the report in the best possible way to identify all the different communities. Once we have taken that public comment and heard from the public and kind of built in the lived experience, we'll have a final report to present to you by June, and kind of ask you to review it, kind of give your stamp of approval, provide any additional feedback. Obviously, we welcome your feedback even before that final report stage, and then hope to build that into sort of one part of the task force's final recommendations as sort of a report on what areas meet the definition. We'll also start working on trying our best to map the areas that meet the definition within our mapping tool, Colorado EnviroScreen, that's going to be replacing the two mapping tools I just showed you. We'll also launch in June, so that we can kind of clearly demarcate the areas that meet that component of the definition in our mapping tool. And then one of the major questions I just want to flag for you that is going to be a challenge that we're going to ask you to try to help us answer is, how do we address historic exclusionary laws that impacted an area with the present day? So since we have a map of Denver's redlining called up, I'll just kind of circle the Highlands area. You can see that this whole quadrant of Northwest Denver was nearly the whole area was redlined, right? It shows up red and yellow on this map. But there's been gentrification in the modern day. So even though it was historically redlined in an area where there's a predominantly Latinx community, it is now no longer a predominantly Latinx community. And if you look at sort of our current mapping tools, you'll see that most of the census block groups within that area no longer meet the definition of DI community under the sort of race, income, and housing cost burden factors. So that's a question of whether areas that kind of have that history should also show up in our present day definition, or if there are ways that we should address that, right? Because it would mean that, for example, say the Sloan's Lake Community Park Association could be could qualify for an environmental mitigation project grant from the advisory board, when that's an area that's fairly gentrified. I think I don't know all the specific demographics, but maybe the advisory board might want to prioritize funding in an area that has more acute needs, and that's going to be sort of a challenging question for you all to grapple with. Yeah, Robin, go ahead.
Thanks, Joel. I don't know if this is I tried to scan the presentation a little, just like so I didn't ask a question that you're going to cover in 2 slides like my original next question. But is this sort of the place where there's room to talk about whether history of environmental racism is in itself like the right criteria, and whether there should be either additional or supplementary criteria like overburdened by pollution kind of currently, or even historically or currently? Is this sort of space where that's the type of thing we should be, or we could be talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. This subcommittee and even this moment, right? Like all of those questions of what is in the definition now and what should it be, and And that, I think in a way you're raising a really good question of like the way the definition is structured now, it is any one of the three categories, right? It's the cumulative impacts overburdened by pollution that we haven't talked about yet, or a history of environmental racism, or the demographic factors. And maybe it should be two of the three, or all three, or maybe the place where we think about the history of environmental racism in our work shouldn't be in this definition, and we should be thinking about it in other ways, right? Like maybe that's something that should provide eligibility for some specific requirement that an agency is doing, but not be part of this overall definition. So yes, this is a space for all those discussions. And kind of curious with that, if anyone has any preliminary thoughts they want to share. We're taking good notes on all the ideas you shared today.
I think it's a really good point that Robin brings up. I mean, you know, when you my family grew up on the east side, moved out to Montbello, and now live in Green Valley Ranch. And you know, for a lot of African Americans in Denver, at one point couldn't cross York Street, and then when you crossed Monaco, it was like a huge milestone as you kind of went east into the city. And then when Montbello got built in the 60s and 70s, Montbello was predominantly African American. And so, but when you look at the east side now, and when I look at the east side, that's like Cole, Whittier, 5 Points. And now you have terms like River North Arts District. And then we go to the north side, you got Highlands. And so I think that as we begin to look at what definitions matter, and we talk about that category to Robin's point around communities with a history of environmental racism, and seeing if that's part of the criteria, that's something where I think, you know, we need to acknowledge, but I don't like moving forward. Like if I were to try to move to the east side now, the home prices there are $600,000-$700,000 at like just the medium, right? 624,000. But like, would that prohibit, you know, someone from wanting to, you know, from like, you know, moving forward in that particular neighborhood when a lot of the folks that historically lived there can't even afford to live there anymore? And so, like, how are we going to have that conversation? We're talking about definitions as well. And I just want to put that in there as just a thought that was in the back of my brain and now coming out just for general conversation.
Thank you, Michael. And any other thoughts? I think it's really important, and you know, who knows where we're going to be at and where you all want to go after the end of this journey together. But I think that concept of how do we acknowledge the critical nature of this history while creating policies that are responsive to present day needs is one of the core challenges of the task force and the subcommittee. So Tyson, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I like to look at things too as, you know, what's the ultimate impact? What ultimate impact does it have? And I think of things like gentrification, where you're going to have developers who are like, hey, look at this neighborhood. It was part of redlining back in the day, and they're exempt. They're not going to have anything come in here. We can go in there, we can build, we can create, you know, all this value and push everybody out. What are those effects that are going to have on the decisions that are made by people with money in the future? So just that cause and effect of that is something I think, not just for this, but as we look at all of these, what are the ultimate effects and what are the potential of things that could happen to the people in those neighborhoods if we don't correctly address how it is placed? Because we do, want to make sure we're coming up with something that protects from future, but also allows for that funding and other things to happen that can, you know, it's not gonna, I don't want to say make up for the past, because it's not, but you want the money going to the right places to help these people out. That's really all I have.
Yeah, it's a really critical point, Tyson, and we have Professor Katie Dickinson from CU Public Health with us today, and I'll just share, Katie, if it's okay, something that you brought up when we were working on the EnviroScreen stakeholder process last fall, which is how do we avoid making the definition of DI community, how do we make it not be modern redlining? Like, how do we not make it something that stigmatizes communities or tells a developer this is a community that isn't going to have the resources to fight back against a proposal they don't like? You know, I think we have to be really thoughtful in how we shape the definition. And you're absolutely right that, you know, the labels that we apply as government can be used by many different people for many different reasons as we structure it and think about history and our shared commitment to helping vulnerable Coloradans who may not have the same resources and addressing environmental health disparities. We have to be really cautious as we shape the definition and make sure that we always keep that in the back of our mind, that there can be unintended consequences to our decisions. So, Ian, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about what Robin had suggested about currently impacted by point source emissions. And I think, you know, something like that gets around whether or not a community has been gentrified or not, if they're actually being impacted by a pollution source at the current moment, you know? And then I still, you know, in the example of North Denver, well, if you still live within 2,000 feet of I-70, then you are being impacted by the infrastructure that serves everybody else, whether or not your income's higher or not. So I would still want to see them engage because they are inhaling toxics.
Thanks, Ian. It's a great point, and I'm excited to hear some ideas beginning to coalesce around, you know, sort of the current impact. And Robin, I'll call on you in a moment. I'll also just share, you know, I think we think a lot about air and water pollution because often those are the most acute short-term pathways for health impacts. But when we think about soil and solid and hazardous waste cleanup, some of those longer-term things, often that sort of soil and HMW, the work of our hazardous materials and waste management division, that is really tied to development trends, right? And so when a community is facing gentrification, part of that discussion involves redevelopment and cleanup, and that's part of our work at CDPHE too. And so, you know, a community that maybe is mostly gentrified or the population is sort of shifting demographics, that's still an area where our work at CDPHE is relevant, and we can't forget about sort of those areas that are in the process of changing. So glad reminder. So go ahead, Rob.
And I was just going to flag, I think what is going to really be helpful is to understand for all what purposes the definition will be used, because like, obviously I live in the health department. And so in my mind, you know, like this is like the things that you covered at the beginning, like engagement and protecting health and addressing climate issues. But, you know, I skipped ahead a couple slides and, you know, you see other agencies. And so this definitely, it gets very overwhelming very quickly, but like, you know, I want to make sure have that conversation about like, well, maybe we have to have a definition that can like serve different agencies. And so that'll, I think, be really helpful to understand like what are other agencies going to use this to do? And it's not just going to be environmental justice, right? It's going to be hopefully, right, broad engagement, justice, and participation, and a lot of potentially other things other than just environmental. And so obviously, I think it's easy for me to get like go down into the weeds of how do we make this important and meaningful in the environmental context. But I just want to, you know, get a sense for, and I hope we're tracking like how other agencies are going to use it, and whether, you know, ultimately, do we recommend to the legislature that like they put this in other agency statutes, or we recommend to other agencies that they use this as a guide for engagement across all of their efforts, or what does that look like? Will help, I think, also frame this conversation.
Thanks, Robin. It's a great point, and I'll also take that as encouragement to move ahead, and we can keep having these great discussions since we're going to get there soon. And I will say that is a critical part of your work, right? One of the things the task force is told to address is the definition of agency, which is in a part of the Administrative Procedure Act where this definition appears. And that definition of agency could potentially apply to every single state agency in Colorado. Right now, it only, as written in the Environmental Justice Act, applies to the Air Quality Control Commission. But that's a question that you all will have to answer and make a recommendation to the legislature. And we don't know the answer. Maybe it does make sense to standardize the definition, and maybe it doesn't because different agencies are using the definition for different purposes. So it's a great flag. Robin, did you have something else? I wasn't sure if your hand was still up, or
No, I'm still
Okay.
bad at Zoom. I'll
Okay.
figure out how to lower my hand in just a minute.
okay. Well, let's move. Thanks, Robin. And I still learn new Zoom things every day. So I'll move on to the next slide then to start talking about cumulative impacts in Colorado EnviroScreen that I've alluded to a couple times. And so this is the Environmental Justice Act, as I mentioned, has a third prong that we call the cumulative impacts prong, which is sort of a summary. And that is, again, I'll read it because it's long and complicated, and I'll read it a little more slowly this time so that everyone can digest. It is a community where multiple factors, including socioeconomic stressors, disproportionate environmental burdens, vulnerability to environmental degradation, and lack of public participation may act cumulatively to affect health and the environment and contribute to persistent disparities. So there's really a lot in there. And we're fortunate that we are well on the way to having a tool to identify that. So we are partnering with a team at Colorado State University, led by Professor David Rojas Rueda, who is actually a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, that is developing Colorado EnviroScreen. And that is going to be an interactive environmental justice mapping tool. It will look a lot like the Climate Equity Data Viewer, but we'll have a chance to make it even better. So you can kind of think of it as the Climate Equity Data Viewer 2.0, but we are renaming it because it talks a lot more than just the climate. EnviroScreen is going to combine multiple metrics, which include environmental exposures, so pollution that people are exposed to, environmental effects, so things that exist in our environment but may or may not cause health impacts, or what likely don't cause health impacts if everything is working according to plan. So something like a landfill or solid waste facility that exists in the landscape but doesn't have a direct impact on our health, assuming it is in fully compliance with its sort of pollution limits. Climate vulnerabilities, so those are things like wildfire risk, drought risk, areas that are more vulnerable to climate change. Demographics, so the three demographic factors we mentioned, as well as other key demographics, like people living with disabilities, people under 5, people over 64, and then a sort of health metrics or sensitive population metrics, so metrics of the incidence of disease that is tied to environmental causes, so things like asthma, cancer, diseases where we know there's an environmental factor that influences it. So it's going to take all that data and combine it, and for every census block group in Colorado, we have a lot of great data sets, and because it's a Colorado specific tool, we can really build in some Colorado specific data sets, look at things like uranium mining, some things that are not always available when we think about national issues. So we are combining all those factors, and then we'll come up with a single score for every census block group in the state of Colorado. So in that way, it will be very similar to Climate Equity Data Viewer. It will be an interactive mapping tool similar to the Climate Equity Data Viewer with sort of a lot of attached information, ways that people can learn more about what's built into the tool. Will also be fully bilingual in English and Spanish. So we were working on developing that. We had our public input phase, as I mentioned, last fall. We've been working on tool development, and then we are actually going to launch the beta test in 3 weeks. We're very close, so that we're planning to have 2 waves of beta tests. The first one is what we'll call a closed beta. So we're going to kind of work specifically with groups of people who we know are likely going to be kind of super users of the tool and ask them to review it. So you all are one of those key groups. The full task force and advisory board will be among our sort of closed wave beta testers. So you'll be getting an email from Lumna or potentially from me, one of the two of us, on February 15th when we launch that closed wave beta. That will give you access to the tool and then sort of a set of questions that we'd like you to kind of think about as you test it out, so that we can get your feedback on everything from user experience, like is this user friendly, to sort of the content matter in the tool. one thing I'll flag now is that we're trying a lot of innovative things. So for example, if you saw the climate equity data viewer, I'll just go back to it. You can see we use this sort of standard, like areas that are darker on the map have a higher score, meaning a higher burden. We're actually doing the inverse of that in EnviroScreen to sort of counter the dominant narrative of dark being bad, sort of thinking about skin color, right? And trying to say, no, areas that are lighter have the higher burden. So we're trying a lot of innovative things, and we really want your feedback on everything, that aspect of user experience, the data that's built in. And so just that's coming. That's going to be one of your homework items that I wanted you to know about. So, and then we'll go into public beta testing of EnviroScreen. So anyone from the whole public will be able to test it out, not just the closed wave folks. Starting in April, we'll kind of do a round of public feedback there, and then we will finalize the tool in June. So EnviroScreen is just a mapping tool though, right? It will identify areas by their sort of overall percentile score. But that doesn't tell us what meets the definition of disproportionately impacted community, right? So EnviroScreen has metrics of all the things that are in the Environmental Justice Act under that cumulative impacts prong built in, but it doesn't tell us specifically like, okay, the Environmental Justice Act doesn't say like everything above the 75th percentile meets the definition of disproportionately impacted community. So a question we would like you all to help us answer as the task force is, one, should we be using EnviroScreen to identify areas under that cumulative impacts prong of the definition? And two, if so, what should sort of the cutoff be? Do we want to set a numeric cutoff at 80% or 90% or 75%, or is there some other approach? So that is kind of one of the key questions we're going to be posing for you all as the task force. So I will pause there to see if anyone has any questions. This is kind of the end of both the discussion of EnviroScreen and the discussion of the definition of DI community in the Environmental Justice Act. So any questions there? Ian, go ahead.
With the idea of moving to just the scoring, are there data gaps that exist that wouldn't be represented in the score, and therefore if we set it just to a score wouldn't achieve the intent of the legislation?
There are definitely data gaps. We don't have perfect data on everything. Like one example I'll share is that we actually don't have data on the boundaries of every public drinking water system in Colorado. Those boundaries shift sometimes on a daily basis as sort of drinking water systems share water across boundaries. So, so we've done our, for example, best guess about water quality metrics, but we don't have sort of that granular data, right? So, I mean, the answer is yes. Like, we won't have perfect data. We've done our best to compile some good data sets, and we're still working on a lot of this. Like, not every single data set will be in the final version is going to even be in the beta version, but so I hope we've done a pretty good job of getting enough data that and kind of closing a lot of those gaps that I think EnviroScreen will cover certainly all the areas that we would want to think about in terms of environmental exposures and environmental health risks. But that is ultimately kind of a question for you, right? Like if you look at an EnviroScreen and you're like, it just, there's not enough in there about this water issue or this waste issue or this air issue to really feel like it's a comprehensive enough metric, we could evaluate other ways of sort of addressing that cumulative impacts prong, right? Or you might all look at EnviroScreen and be like, you don't need cumulative impacts in that sort of prong in the definition at all. So we think we've done a good job, but it won't be perfect, and that could be sort of part of what you think about.
Well, it makes me think about maintenance of such a tool, right? And then how current it is for current discussions that are happening. I think that that's obviously important. And then, I don't know, I missed my opportunity to participate in the EnviroScreen, even though I was invited. I was just overwhelmed. But, I think about violations, even though they're self-reported. I think that violations that are self-reported at least would be something that would be cool if I could go to this tool and find and say, these are communities that we know have known violations and it has is X, Y, and Z other issues. I could layer them.
Yeah, that's really great feedback. And by the way, we're taking notes on all of your feedback. So it's never too late to give us feedback on EnviroScreen. We actually heard that theme about sort of including violations of permit terms or enforcement actions out from multiple folks who gave us input last fall. We are the way that we have approached it is we are using sort of a violations-based metric for our drinking water data. So the drinking water indicator in EnviroScreen is actually sort of metric of how many violations of Safe Drinking Water Act standards there have been for each public water system in an area, also sort of weighted according to their severity, right? So weighting a health-based violation higher than like a paperwork violation, basically. So we are taking that approach in water quality. We haven't taken that approach in air. We've kind of used an emissions-based approach using APENs, which are air pollution emission notification data. But that's good feedback, right, that we can take. And then in terms of like the long term, we are planning to update and maintain EnviroScreen over time. So our hope is to launch EnviroScreen 2.0 in about a year, right, and kind of continuously update the data sets. And it's one of the main advantages of using EnviroScreen instead of relying on federal tools like EJScreen, where the data is often like good but pretty out of date. Like the air toxics data in EJScreen, I think, is from like 2013 or 2014, but we can get sort of continuously updated data on something like air toxics emissions from our APEN database at the state level that we are able to update over time. Of course, also build in new metrics over time.
Okay, two just follow-up questions. I apologize everybody else for dragging this on, but I heard you were saying drinking water standards. Does that also apply to other clean water violations, so stormwater issues? Because I mean, in our own analysis of work we've done just in North Denver, right, we found 100 clean water violations that aren't drinking water standard necessarily, but have to do with stormwater. And these are also places people recreate, and it is cumulative. And then my second point of view is, I can appreciate the weighted nature of paperwork violations or whatever, but if we're going to talk about historic harms, technicalities and bullshit paper stuff is what put a lot of Black and brown people in jail over the years. And if we're just going to give a pass to corporations because they couldn't get their paperwork done, and at the same time somebody misses something and they end up with a warrant, that's not equal treatment in the way in which our communities see minor violations.
Yeah, well, I'll take the first point first and just say we haven't been focusing on sort of enforcement data or violations for the clean water side, like surface water. We've actually been using a metric that is, we'll say actually the surface water metric has been the hardest one to develop. So we are still like in the process of compiling that data set for a number of reasons that does sort of a combined score based on the use classification of a stream and whether a stream meets that use classification. So every water body under the Clean Water Act has to be classified according to multiple uses. Is it fishable, swimmable, etc.? And many streams in Colorado and throughout the nation do not meet the water quality standard for their use designation. So you have sort of a multifaceted algorithm based on like how many of the uses that a stream is designated for that its water quality doesn't meet. So it's focused more on sort of the water body rather than sort of individual dischargers into the water body, since water moves a lot. But we could definitely think about using that metric again, or using a metric based on sort of penalty actions or enforcement actions or permit violations that are focused on the discharger. So that's good feedback. We also are using a metric of unclassified streams. So a lot of stream segments in Colorado have actually never had use designations made, and we know that that tends to be more true in low-income communities and communities of color, that sort of the resources haven't been designated to even making those use designations in the first place. So we're sort of using a combined metric that weights what percentage of stream miles are unclassified with the sort of lack of meeting the different use designations and combining those mathematically in a formula that I don't know off the top of my head to sort of get that answer.
I think Katie Dickinson, who I've been working with, right? A lot of that came out of the ECHO database from the EPA. So I think that that's good. And I just want to circle back to just on that second thing about the violations, I mean, not filing paperwork is like a failure of transparency. And that's been one of the #1 concerns about our community, is the lack of transparency and ability to get information easily.
Yeah, so that, and it's a great point. Like I don't like the term paperwork violation, even though I just used it here, but so I totally hear that, and we can take that back and think about it in EnviroScreen. I think because we're also trying to think about where are there environmental health burdens, like we wanted a way to sort of give extra weight to things that we know are definitely causing a health impact, right? In terms of like, and we also sort of look at different pollutants in drinking water differently. Like there are some things that have, for example, going back to Lahana, most of the Arkansas Valley in southeast Colorado has long-term non-compliance with radium standards, sort of radiological health standards in their drinking water. That's a long-term significant acute health or chronic health risk, right? But there are also often very acute time-sensitive things that can really impact our health in the short term. And so we have to kind of figure out how do we balance all these different pollutants that affect our health differently in a way that like gives a sort of accurate ranking of like the risk that people in different areas face from their drinking water. And so that's sort of what David, Professor Rojas at CSU, who's an environmental epidemiologist, is working on with like our toxicology and environmental epidemiologist team to figure out all of those different weightings and kind of where something like a paperwork violation fits in. And you're right, they're significant and they're a problem, and we take enforcement actions on those things. And often, you know, a paperwork violation might be a reason that we don't know data about an actual health risk that exists, right? If someone's not filing their reports, or a lot of those relate to public water systems that are operating without a registered operator, which is a big challenge in rural areas. A lot of those rural areas just can't get enough workforce to sort of hire someone who's certified, and that means that there could be significant issues that are going missed. So I definitely don't mean to diminish the importance of those paperwork violations, and I think it's great feedback we can take back to the EnviroScreen team about like thinking about that weighting system and kind of how we look at it to make sure that the scoring is done accurately. So Robin, go ahead.
Well, one idea that I was thinking of is that, you know, I'm medium to familiar with AIR's, like the various record keepings and how we store information, in particular, like compliance actions. And I don't know anything about how water and waste do it, or, you know, certainly not other agencies, but to the extent there is a broader movement to make data available and accessible. And one potential option is, instead of like having, or to consider, would be to link, like if what you're thinking is, you know, you'd be able to look at an area and find source information, would be to link to that source's location in, for example, AIR's record system, right? It's the public online system, and you'd automatically be sent to the place where the public records are stored about that source, which would include compliance data, permit data, you know, things of that nature, inspection reports, etc. I mean, I don't know if people would find that helpful. Like, I don't find it always helpful to provide too much information without context, right? But I'm just thinking like there's a lot of enforcement actions that the health department does. And so like, what's the most effective way to like get people who are curious about what enforcement cases have happened at that source? I don't know, just something I was thinking, like you could link to that source's location in the online record system.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. And again, I promise, writing these all down and we'll take them back. I think, you know, with water, we definitely do want to link. There's kind of an online database the same way, where you can kind of see all the violations in your community according to kind of geographic area for different public drinking water systems. So yeah, having links or ways to sort of interactively get that information is critical, and it's something we want to try to build into EnviroScreen wherever possible. And you know, I think what you talked about is also a really important concept that's maybe not necessarily have to be part of EnviroScreen, but for our overall environmental justice efforts, think about transparency in the enforcement space. It's an area where we can do a lot more. So call on Renee, and then I want to move on because I'm well behind my planned time. So Renee, go ahead.
I'll try to be fast then. Honestly, maybe just looking at data as more an intersectional space than being able to overlap. Maybe if there were historical environments or historical spaces of racism or even predatory practices in housing, how does that relate to even the air and water quality now? That's a real thing because it's also where some communities still are. At least it is here in Commerce City or where it was Old Derby. So paying attention to how data can overlap and use it in context too can really be key in helping this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why EnviroScreen is exciting, because we will be able to overlay multiple sources of data. And I'll quote Senator Rhonda Fields during the oversight hearing of CDPHE earlier today, was talking a lot about thinking about hotspots. What are our hotspots where we look at overlaying all that different data? And that's what EnviroScreen will do, is it will show us where those hotspots are. That is where we need to focus our resources in improving the environment. So totally agree with that. Okay, so moving on now, and we can always come back to all of this later if there are more questions. And oh, I'm so sorry. I I meant to answer Professor Dickinson's question in the chat too, who asked sort of about how are we going to update EnviroScreen over time. We will have a staff person in the environmental justice unit who works with the toxicology and environmental epidemiology office to update the sort of data that changes each year, at least on an annual basis. And then we have a growing list of sort of data sets that we want to build into the tool over time. So, but it's also a great question of how would that impact the definition, because the definition will kind of have to be frozen at a point in time. And I think that is a great discussion you all can think about, is assuming we rely on EnviroScreen, how do we address the fact that the definition could potentially change over time? Okay, Michael, go ahead. I jumped too far ahead to saying.
I'm so sorry. You may have already answered this, but so can we give you access? Can we give you our data sets that can go into EnviroScreen?
Yeah, we would encourage you to send it to us, right?
Okay.
If you have data, you know, I think like it's a question that we've grappled with, is how do we, like, if a community has data they think is important to share, but like maybe doesn't fit into our rubric of like
Right.
we need something statewide, or like it's not built into the score, how do we show that? And I think we want to have some ways of linking to community resources or community pages where like, okay, like we I'll just share, like, a lot of mobile home parks have significant water quality challenges, right? So if you're looking on EnviroScreen and you are kind of like looking at a mobile home park in, say, Pueblo County, where a lot of these issues have come up, and you're like, I feel like my story is not told here, and like maybe a community group has a story they want to tell. Like, we want to kind of create interactive links and opportunities for storytelling or other data that's maybe relevant but not statewide, and find ways to sort of link that and share that through EnviroScreen. So does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So now I will move on to the next slide. Sorry about that. I get so excited talking about all this stuff. Now we're going to turn from what is CDPHE's current definition in the Environmental Justice Act to what are all the other state agency definitions. So this is a slide that compares the definitions across state agencies. So it's very text dense and legal. I apologize for that. But you can see there are currently 5 different agencies that have a definition of disproportionately impacted communities. So we've been talking about the CDPHE definition, which again currently does only apply to the Air Quality Control Commission in the Environmental Justice Act. CDOT, the Department of Transportation, also has a definition. It is and this was adopted this year in Senate Bill 21-260. It's basically the same, except it does not include the history of environmental racism or cumulative impacts prong. So it is just those 3 demographic components. The Public Utilities Commission also has a definition that was adopted by the legislature this year in Senate Bill 21-272. That definition is the same, but it has a sort of 3-part definition of low income. So that includes the one part that's in the CDPHE definition of a median household income at or below 10% of the federal poverty line, but also sort of what I call a relative metric, where the median household income in an area is less than 80% of the area average, and then also areas that sort of qualify for low-income energy assistance under a definition set by the Department of Human Services. So, Robin, go ahead.
Sorry, so this is awesome. Thank you to whoever put this together. I have two requests. One is, could somebody drop these statutes in our subcommittee folder? And then what I find is missing, my immediate next question after reading this is like, what does it mean in these other statutes? Like, what purpose does it serve? And I'm wondering if there's a way to add that row, like a summary of, what's it used for in these other statutes, if that be possible.
Yes, and yes. Yeah. Making this slide was very hard, but has also made my life a lot easier ever since I made it. So, and yeah, those are both great additions. We can get copies of the statute in your folder, and then also kind of outline what does it mean for each of those agencies.
Thank you. It's really helpful. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so then Colorado Parks and Wildlife, this is easy. It's actually the exact same definition as the Environmental Justice Act. So remember I mentioned earlier that the Environmental Justice Act actually modifies what's called the Administrative Procedure Act. That's Colorado statute Title 24, Article 4. So if you see that 24.4 up there, that's what it means. The Administrative Procedure Act actually applies to all state agencies, but the way that the Environmental Justice Act works is it actually defines agency as Air Quality Control Commission. So when we're talking about the definition right now, it could hypothetically apply to other agencies because it's in the Administrative Procedure Act, but it limits it. In a different law that was also passed last year, the Keep Colorado Wild Act, sorry, I might have gotten that wrong. It relates to sort of park passes for low-income folks and making sure that we're getting outdoor equity. So that statute sort of tacked something on to the end of the section of the Administrative Procedure Act that then essentially makes the same definition that's in the Environmental Justice Act also apply to Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So that's how that worked. Robin, is your hand still up because you have a question? Okay. Sorry.
No, bad at Zoom.
No worries. Okay, and then last but certainly not least, COGCC also has a definition of its own, and I will just share prior to this job, my job was that I was the Assistant Attorney General, so the lawyer who worked in the Attorney General's office representing COGCC in its rulemaking process where it adopted these rules. So it's something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about for years, which is why I'm so excited for this conversation. And COGCC actually adopted its definition through a regulation. So this was adopted by the agency, not by the legislature. And it adopted its definition before any of these other entities. So it was adopted in November 2020 as part of COGCC's mission change rulemaking. And it's pretty different than the others. My guess is that maybe it was potentially a template used by the legislature to build on in the other, in these various statutes. So it also includes metrics of both race and income, but it looks at race differently. It uses it does also use the term minority, but sort of references back to the EPA definition of minority, which is basically the same as what we're interpreting minority in the other context, just meaning all people of color, so anyone who doesn't identify as non-Hispanic white. But it includes both an absolute metric of 50% of the population in a census block group and a relative metric. So any census block group where the percent people of color is higher than the percent people of color in the county as a whole. So it looks both at overall how many people of color live in an area that it uses a higher threshold, 50% rather than 40%. And also relative, is there an area where there's more people of color than the average for that county? For income, it's basically the same, except that it just says areas where the median household income is at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. So that again essentially uses a 50% threshold. So at least the median rate is 50%. So at least half the households in the census block group are at or below 200% of the federal poverty line, whereas the definition used by the other state agencies is using that 40% threshold. So kind of higher thresholds on both of those metrics. And then finally, rather than housing cost burden, it has a metric of linguistic isolation, which is census speak for people who speak a language other than English at a language other than English at home. So it looks at sort of language justice as its third metric rather than housing cost burden. So I will pause there. Those are the 5 definitions. Any questions, feedback, thoughts? And note that there may be some that we've missed and just aren't aware of, but as far as we know, these are the 5 places where this definition shows up for different state agencies.
And Joel, Katie had a comment question in the chat.
Thank you. I have too many screens. I'm not doing a good job of monitoring the chat. Yeah, so Katie, that's a great point of like, it would be useful to understand what these mean in practice. As far as I know, only COGCC has also created maps of its definition. Kelly, I see you from the PUC here. I apologize if I'm wrong. You can correct me if the PUC has created a map, but I believe that sort of the maps I shared today are the only visual representations besides COGCC's map, and we can definitely share out some links to where you can go look at the areas. Thanks, Kelly, for confirming the PUC doesn't have its own map. But we can share out a link so you can see the areas that fall under COGCC's definition. It's definitely a narrower definition, right? It's a higher threshold. Housing cost burden brings in a lot of places in the state. So I think that's ultimately going to be a question of you is, do you want to take an approach that's narrower like COGCC, so we're kind of more narrowly focused on a few areas, or do you want to take a broader definition like what's in the Environmental Justice Act that brings in more areas? Other questions, comments, feedback here? Oh, Katie, thank you. Yeah, we would really appreciate that. Any resources we have. It's been really great to get support from lots of our different academic institutions and community partners and all of this work to kind of implement the Environmental Justice Act. Ian, go ahead.
I'm just curious. I know that this definition exists inside CPW because we worked on I think the Outdoor Equity Fund, I think is kind of what drew some of this DI. I'm not sure. But I'm curious if this definition is being used internally by other agencies in the Department of Natural Resources.
Yeah, I think the sort of Keep Colorado Wild's Pass Act may relate to that outdoor equity work, though there were 2 outdoor equity laws passed last year, and I will confess that I sort of get the 2 of them mixed up sometimes. So, and we do have Megan as our DNR representative on this subcommittee. I don't know if she's still here, but obviously COGCC is part of the Department of Natural Resources and is using its definition. I'm not sure if other DNR agencies like the Colorado Water Conservation Board, the State Engineer's Office, the Avalanche Information Center, or Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety that regulates hard rock mining have really sort of developed or used DI community definitions, but it's a good question. And Megan, it's okay, maybe I can call on you and see if you have any insight there about whether there's sort of definition or geographically focused DI community work happening in other DNR agencies that you're aware of.
Was that a question for me, Joel?
Sorry, it was a question for Megan. Though Katie, if you know the answer, please feel free to weigh in. Maybe looks like Megan might not be able to answer right now. Okay.
Looks like her audio is connected.
Yeah, I wonder if she's been having some Zoom trouble. Wait, it's a good question for us to follow up on, Ian, and we can kind of bring that back as part of one of our questions to answer as staff at the next subcommittee meeting. So. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to the next slide then. And now that we've kind of covered some background information on the 2 meta questions that we hope you all can answer as a subcommittee, which again is what should the definition be? Who should it apply to? We wanted to break out some questions a little more specifically for you to think through. These are just our ideas on what questions you should answer. They're not the questions that you have to answer. So please, feel free to tell us other questions you think you should be answering, or if you think some are not that important, but we just tried to kind of prompt these for future discussion. So the first is essentially geographic scope, like is the census block group the right level, which is the one, the level that is being used by all these different agencies, but not necessarily the only potential level. And then second within that, how do we account for a smaller area that probably is the disproportionately impacted community that is within a larger area that doesn't meet the definition? So I'll just kind of the classic example that has come up a couple times in our work so far is mobile home parks that tend to be low-income communities, often are home to many people of color, and might be within a larger area that doesn't meet the definition for some other reason. So is there a way that we can kind of address those small communities? Demographic questions, I think we've talked about these already, but what should numeric thresholds be? I do think sort of a question of does it make sense to include housing cost burden is worth discussing. I think we've heard a lot of feedback of why do Aspen and Boulder show up in our definition? I think that's sort of the question we want you all to think about, and if there's a way we can reflect housing costs, which are really a challenge for folks in a way that kind of tailors the definition in a way that makes sense to all of you. And then finally, is the term minority the right question to use, right? I alluded to this earlier, but it's not defined in the statute. It's confusing and also problematic, and I think for many communities, and might be a topic for you all to consider in your recommendations, whether you think the legislature should change it. We all have also talked a lot about this already, so I won't spend more time, but just sort of how do we think about communities with the history of environmental racism, and where that fits in the definition, given kind of current day realities. The cumulative impacts component, we've also talked about this, like is EnviroScreen really what we should be using for that sort of component to identify communities? And if so, what sort of percentile within EnviroScreen should we use as the threshold? And then finally, we've talked about this also, who should the definition apply to? Are there benefits and consistency across state government or not? And how much of that should sort of be tied to different substantive requirements, or should different agencies use different definitions depending on substantive action they're taking? So these are a lot of questions that are not going to be easy to answer, but kind of curious feedback upon hearing these. Are there any obvious questions you feel like we've left out, or anything that shouldn't be on the list?
Are they all on this one slide, or they're on the slide before? There's like 3 slides, right?
Sorry, there's 2 slides. I put too many words on to fit on one slide. So thank you to Lubna for pointing out when we did our run through that the text was too small to read when I put it all on one. So it's just these 2 slides.
I have just a community engagement question here. Are these slides available in Espanol if I want to share these with community members?
We actually haven't translated them yet, but that was a question that we were going to pose to you later, is how we want to approach language justice for this subcommittee. So I'm kind of assuming if you do want to be able to share them out, the answer is yes. So I think we can go ahead and have Rosario translate them. Thank you, Rosario, and make them available in Spanish as well.
Joel, it's just, are these like a homework assignment, or do you want us to kind of get into answering these questions right now? Or can we take some time to think it over?
Yeah, you can take some time to think it over. We do have homework coming up on a later slide. I fast forwarded. So no, these are just kind of big picture questions that we hope you all will answer through the work subcommittee.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we have many months to answer. Okay, with that, maybe I'll go on to the timeline. Oh, Ian, go ahead.
I had one more, and I'm not sure how to like frame it in this question, but on the most recent methane, oil and gas rulemaking, for example, there was conversation of large census blocks, right, that were part of the conversation, but the regulations themselves wouldn't impact people because the census blocks are so big and like the people are actually concentrated. And so there was a question I saw here about what happens if there's a smaller DI enclave within a non-DI census tract. And I think the other thing is what happens if the census tract is very large and it's not actually impacting people.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
And I think we talked about it with the EJ community, and there were a lot of people who were like rights to nature, and I agree with that in a lot of ways, but I just a real world example that came up literally a month ago.
No, it's a great example, Ian, and we should definitely add that as kind of another category here, because yeah, the sort of how do we account for a large area where the people might be concentrated far away from the pollution sources, which from an environmental justice perspective, again, not thinking about sort of impacts on the physical environment, that might be a good thing, right? Like we want our pollution to not be co-located with where vulnerable communities live. So, it is worth thinking about and absolutely should be part of this discussion, and was also something that came up when COGCC, the Oil and Gas Commission, adopted its regulatory definition and emission change rulemaking. Okay, well, I'm gonna move us along to the next slide then. These are really great feedback, and please keep sending them to Lumna and I in between meetings. We want to hear your thoughts or random questions you wake up with in the middle of the night so that we can kind of keep building on this list. So this is a draft timeline that we've put together of what we can hopefully accomplish. You'll see it goes only until June, not because we think our work as the subcommittee will be done in June, but because we'd love to kind of be in a place to take back recommendations to the wider task force by June, so that the task force, you all as a whole, can start coming up with some draft recommendations and have enough time to get feedback on the recommendations on every single topic from the public. We want to have sort of a robust opportunity for public engagement and input and feedback. So that's kind of why we have that June timeline that we've tentatively identified for kind of the subcommittee coming up with preliminary recommendations. So we sketched out some kind of rough ideas of what we could do in sort of different months, assuming you all do want to meet about once a month, which is our recommendation. In March, kind of maybe talk about debriefing on EnviroScreen and talking about sort of maybe that topic of consistency across state agencies. In April, thinking about the demographic definition and the sort of cumulative impacts component of the definition. May, focusing on kind of the history of environmental racism component of the definition, and then June, working on kind of trying to come up with some final decisions and recommendations to the broader task force. But that is a tentative rough draft, right? It is our best proposal as your staff. So would love to hear what you all think about that timeline. Ian, go ahead.
Did I leave my hand up?
Oh, you might have.
Yeah. No, I mean, since I got called on, I do think that there maybe early on there might be opportunities to bring in maybe some speakers from other states or nationally who have worked towards these kind of definitions. It would just be interesting to hear their perspective if they're further along than we were.
Absolutely. That's a really great suggestion. Michael.
Yeah, I did carry on to what Ian said. I was just going to say, on the broader community engagement, not just national speakers, but in this timeline, I saw earlier that you all were thinking of a community meeting as well. I think in that May timeframe. But it's not represented here because I like to kind of, as we're developing these DIC definitions, I like to kind of make sure that we're touching base with our communities.
Absolutely, and I realize I don't really have a slide for that, and that is kind of what we wanted to talk about next, is kind of asking you all, how do you want to approach getting public input? So we definitely will do that sort of public session on reviewing the draft report on the history of environmental racism, but I think as a subcommittee, we can really implement any model you want. So we could have time for public comment at every meeting. We could sort of open up a specific written comment, to have time for dialogue with the public. We did also want to ask you about your preferences on language justice. Like, should we have interpretation for these meetings? Should we translate? Are there languages we think we should try to work on besides Spanish? So maybe we don't have a good slide for that, so I will stop sharing my screen and just kind of open it up for that discussion of how do you want to engage with the public through our work.
Should we lean in on the public engagement subcommittee? Because they're doing the work along the way. And I mean, I feel like we would be stepping into their lane, if we could just say, hey, this is what we want to do. And then there's the real world example that they can apply any new principles to that they've been working towards.
Yeah, so Ian, do you mean kind of use the same process that they kind of identified that they want to use during their subcommittee meeting of kind of having some focus groups and opportunity for public comment, or what are you thinking about?
I only attended part of that meeting
Okay.
on Monday, so I actually don't know the full scope of what they're talking about, and perhaps focus grouping isn't the same thing here, right? I don't know if that works for us or not, but I think in the spirit of collaboration, we can say, look, we have a goal of doing this. Can you give us some recommendations on what you think the best way of getting there is as you've been developing your best practices?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we can do that, sort of both solicit advice and replicate some of their practices. We actually are doing some focus groups on EnviroScreen already. So like maybe we don't have to do, I always try to be cautious about what we often call meeting fatigue, right? Like asking, especially Black and Brown communities that are disproportionately impacted by pollution to come to so many different meetings on different topics. So think about whether we can maximize efficiency in some of that. But yeah, I think it's a great suggestion to kind of both ask for input from the community engagement subcommittee and also try to just follow their lead in what they're doing in their own work.
And I would also say, I think the legislation calls us out, and I think we know this, that there are some communities that have a third language that's the most spoken. And so if you are doing targeted focus grouping, really like trying to meet the needs of the community you're trying to engage.
Yes, definitely hear that. And I think that's often really challenging in some of our statewide efforts like this, where we're trying to think about what makes the most sense for the whole state. And I think in CDPHE, I think it sort of ended up being Somali that we end up with as a non-English or Spanish language, just kind of given some of the impacted populations in Greeley and Fort Morgan, where we kind of have a lot of sources of both air and particularly water pollution. But so maybe the answer is working in Somali as kind of a third language. But if there's other languages where you're like, there's, this, for example, I've heard suggestions of what about putting information in mute or asking the tribes if they'd like information translated. Like, I think we can explore. So if you have options that are kind of a specific reason that you think there's a community we're not effectively reaching with both English and Spanish, we're really open to that. And also thinking through what materials make sense to translate. So just let us know.
I kind of just ditto. I think lean on the community engagement subcommittee. Obviously, I don't want to replicate their work, and I think there are communities that don't speak English, and so how do we tailor a community engagement effort that incorporates their voice into the dialogue? But I think the only thing that I would add, it's great dialogue, would be some parallel engagement track with industry as well. So I do think that there's some professionals who are in the work, who are trying to be a part of this conversation, who have a lot of background and knowledge. And so how do you get their voice captured in these conversations as well?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for pointing that out. And the oil and gas industry has, I think, been really proactive in reaching out to us about this question, I think because they have more experience, given the COGCC definition that exists and the fact that there are different definitions that apply to the oil and gas sector between air and COGCC right now. So I think it's a good point that industry stakeholders have to be part of the discussion in order for us to make sure that the people who are actually going to be taking different actions as a result of what we define here have a chance to point out things we might be missing, right? Or I think that consistency question, for example, is one where I don't know what voices in the industry think, and also what kind of communities impacted by the oil and gas industry think of should there be a different definition between air and COGCC. So it's a really interesting thing that we should keep in the back of our minds too. So Tyson, go ahead.
I just wanted to bring up kind of the point related to that. I mean, Joel, obviously, as you know, being part of the last COGCC rulemaking, the complexities that come in making statewide rules that apply across the board inevitably leave somebody out somewhere and have other things. So I think one of the things that me personally, to look at in community engagement, and I agree that we do lean on the community engagement committee, but at the same time, understanding what our goal is and how that goal affects the holistic view of this future plan is how, you know, how the whole process is going to work. And obviously that's a chicken before the egg conversation right there. You know, as we define these terms, we define these areas, you know, that's going to increase community engagement. That's going to create more interested parties and stakeholders in decisions that are made that will impact people of the community. But how does it really work? Because I think we do need to be able to go to those committees and say, this is what the definition is going to do for you, and be very clear on that. And I myself, even being part of this and understanding and reading the act and going through it, still have questions in regards to how is this really going to work. So if I don't understand how it's going to work, how can I really say that the definition I'm going to come up with is going to be sufficient or not? And I get the chicken before they. There is going to be a piece of, we got to implement something, try it out, and if it's not working, fix it. But we want to be as close as possible to getting it right. So, you know, that's kind of where my brain is at with that. I do agree with leaning on them, but I think that we do need to give them some direction as to what we're missing. And hey, we really need to talk to these people because these are the greatest impacts for this definition, the way it's used in the upcoming process that's going to be put behind it. Those are just my thoughts.
Thanks, Tyson. That's a really good point. And I think that's a consistent theme we've been hearing is like, we need to understand like what the operational requirements based on this definition are, so that it's great. And I think we can explore bringing in the folks from different agencies who are implementing the definition. I mean, we have Robin here who has done that through the Air Quality Control Commission rulemaking, but maybe bring in Sabrina Trask from COGCC, who's been implementing their definition. See if we can we have Kelly Crandall here with us today as well from the PUC, kind of make sure that you all are hearing from the agency staff and others who are implementing the definition, community groups, and who are applying for grants, and kind of make sure that you all have a clear picture of what this definition means in practice. So, Ian, go ahead.
I just wanted to circle back and say, I do think it would be valuable even if we had a small amount of time that was carved out for public comment, because I do think that whereas best as we can get the community engaged, and look, we let Katie kind of respond there, but you know, what happens if we have more people, and how can we be a little bit more cognizant of creating space for them so they know that's their space. And then I guess the second thing I wanted to ask, because you brought up the Ute, I'm really curious, you know, here we are now in our second subcommittee meeting. We've already had a meeting. We're preparing for elections. Are we anywhere closer to having tribal representation? And I came across an article with the Southern Ute making the same complaint about the Bureau of Land Management about not including them just from a couple months ago. So I can only assume they're overwhelmed with a lot of process, but I'm just, are we anywhere closer with that? Because the further along we get down the track, the more wrong it feels to me.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. I wish I could tell you we were closer. I can just share that we did receive a letter from the chairperson of the Southern Ute Tribal Council saying that they would not appoint a member to this task force, but we're trying to negotiate and do everything we can to encourage them to rethink that, or at least try to explore other options for how we could get the tribe's input in a way that would really make sure your recommendations are useful for the tribal government. And so I'm hopeful those negotiations will proceed in a way that brings that tribal representation. I can't promise though, but it's something we're spending a lot of time on.
Can you
I'm more,
can you share that letter to us? Because I think hearing directly from the tribe's perspectives and not straight through you or anybody else, I think could be really beneficial for all of us on the task force of seeing that.
I agree.
yeah, I think we can. I will share that, I guess, there are some statements in the letter that, at least in my personal view, are inaccurate, especially about when we reached out to the tribes to ask for their participation. We did so in August, a month after the EJ Act was signed, and the letter says that we did so in October, which was when we did send sort of a formal letter memorializing the discussions we've been having. So I do want to just frame that, like, please know that we have been working really hard for months. Like, this is one of the first meetings I had as a member of CDPHE to try to work on getting that tribal representation. And I think the reasons that the Southern Ute tribe has not made its appointment relate to sort of other challenges in the tribe's relationship with CDPHE in the past, and the fact that the state government doesn't have authority over tribal governments. Tribes are their own sovereigns, and we can't regulate them. We can't regulate activities on tribal lands and under tribal jurisdiction, which is often challenging for the Southern Ute because of the history of environmental racism, because the Southern Ute tribe was their lands were allotted, which was a terrible federal government policy in the 1950s designed to break up tribal ownership of their own lands and resulted in sort of a patchwork of areas under tribal jurisdiction and not under tribal jurisdiction within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. So there's a long and complicated history there that I think this is one small part of, but that's sort of where the challenge has been. I will say that in general, CDPHE has had a much more positive working relationship with the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. I think potentially also relating back to that history, the Ute Mountain Ute lands were not allotted, so that their reservation is intact, and those challenging jurisdictional questions about who can regulate don't exist in Ute Mountain Ute lands. It's just clear the state has no authority because there are no private lands checkerboarded in with the tribal lands, and so I think we're more optimistic that we will have a representative from Ute Mountain Ute, and it's more a matter of just time and resources for a tribal government with limited staff to make the appointment. So we are working with both tribes, and I hope we will get there, but yeah, I just want to be frank that that's where we are now. So Renee, did you have a comment too?
Because of that, especially in urban spaces, I would ask that you reach out to local nonprofits or create a whole space for nonprofits to continue their own coalitions to recognize these are disproportionate communities inside disproportionately impacted communities in these spaces. And it is walking with that type of trauma sensitivity and cultural sensitivity that Ute, Mountain Ute, and Southern Ute are only two that were able to keep their reservation, but that's also because they had alignment with other predatory industries at that time to keep that space. So at least some of them did. But some in urban spaces were also relocated here from other spaces or have been dislocated from here, like Cheyenne and Arapaho, and being able to reclaim that, yeah, we still have our communities here actually, and we're still struggling. And it's really hard to gain that representation or be engaged in these spaces or even be able to supply that type of data unless it's seen in that context and done with complete outreach and also incentives for those communities to be able to join in these spaces too. So it's including language in other spaces, but if I were you, I would start reaching out to local nonprofits and other spaces that represent those communities for a reason, because even in that space, in the nonprofit complex, equity is treated as charity there too. So that might help to start filling those data gaps as well, potentially.
Thanks, Renee. It's a great suggestion. And I think I would also just say, if you or other members of the task force are tied to sort of groups working on Indigenous rights and issues, you should tell us, because we don't want to have folks who we should be reaching out to, who we just don't know about and we miss. We
Tomorrow, there's actually an Indigenous panel that can relate even sex trafficking to a lot of these spaces too, and how it's been for a really long time by industrial spaces as well. That's another cumulative impact. So it's another DI community and a DI community.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that Indigenous communities are impacted by so many issues related to the environment, but then go beyond, and that is why this disproportionate impact and thinking about multiple forms of vulnerabilities across socioeconomics is critical. So would welcome if you share the information about that upcoming event or other groups we should connect with. We definitely want to. And I think I'm going to take us back, if it's okay, to our slideshow. I just realized we're at 10 minutes, and there's a couple of things I do want to share with you all. So just really quickly, I fast forwarded it to this earlier. Sorry, computer is now freezing. So we do have a couple specific next steps or homework items that we would ask all of you to sort of reflect on before the next meeting. These are kind of playing around in the existing mapping tools that I shared earlier, the Climate Equity Data Viewer and Data Viewer for DI communities, kind of seeing how they work, participating in that EnviroScreen first closed wave beta test, thinking about how we can get the input of communities' lived experience to both to Renee's point just now as we kind of work through all of our work, including particularly related to the history of environmental racism. Kind of think hard about the value of standardizing the definition across agencies, and then tell us who else we need to hear from, right? Tell us, as you just have been, we should be asking to come give presentations or speak or participate in these discussions. So with that and 8 minutes to spare, maybe we can turn to electing our chair. So Lumna, have you received any messages from folks who are nominated or were nominating someone else during the meeting about for that chair spot?
I have not yet, but if anybody wants to drop that in the chat now or come off mute to nominate or self-nominate, please do.
Maybe I can just share kind of what the job would entail. Sort of what we envision is really someone who can coordinate with me and with Lumna to organize and plan the agendas for these meetings, right? And then also preside over them. So I've been facilitating today as staff, but we really would like sort of a task force member who can kind of move us on from point A to point B, kind of organize the discussion, call a vote when we need a vote, and really just kind of take a role between meetings to help us plan what we should be talking about and make sure we're on track. So any nominees given that? I forgot I was still screen sharing, I'm sorry. Any volunteers? We would really love to have someone. It will not be a significant time commitment. It just means kind of, you know, monitoring your email between.
Joe, I hate to leave you hanging like that. I hate those awkward silences. Can we think on it? Can you give us some time to think on it? I'm not trying to belabor this conversation, but you know, I'm taking the awkward silence as either people are still thinking about it or, you know.
Yeah, we can, I guess. It is really, given the condensed timeline that we have, it's helpful for us to just know who we should be coordinating with to plan the agenda. And I guess maybe I can sort of just propose a sort of option then, is if you all aren't ready to choose a chair or aren't sure you need one or want one, we could always just say that at the next meeting, we as staff will sort of manage the agenda, kind of facilitate, and then see if you all want to choose a chair at the next meeting. But Robin, go ahead.
One thought I had is that if we, to make it easier on folks, I'm not, except for maybe Joel, your team, is we could have, you know, rotating chairs. So one of us, we could just like take turns. So, you know, I'd be happy to work with the EJ unit, setting up the next meeting, doing the agenda, and then at the end of that meeting, like somebody else might volunteer to help plan the meeting after. Is that a terrible suggestion? I don't, or, you know, we could talk about it again. Anyway, I'm volunteering to help plan the next meeting while we like figure out what we want to do. But that's one option too. How we could do it that way.
I like that idea.
See a thumbs up. Megan, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, just that if it's around, you know, agenda setting and communication, I'm happy to help with that as well. I'm also time limited, so I didn't want to, you know, if there's a way to share that responsibility, I'm happy to jump in earlier, knowing that I'll be out after March 30th.
Yeah, well, I think that model can absolutely work to kind of rotate. And I love the idea of power sharing, where we didn't propose co-chairs, as Lumina said, just because it's a small group, but it's a good way for everyone to take an active role. So does that sound okay? Just kind of at each meeting, solicit a volunteer for who's gonna kind of chair and organize and help us plan the agenda for the next meeting. Some nods, and then Robin, Megan, seems like maybe both of you volunteered for the next meeting. Do either of you
I
have
can
a strong?
help too.
Okay, great. So, I like all these volunteers. So Michael, Ian, yeah, no one volunteered to be the sole chair, and we've been discussing an alternative of kind of having rotating and a different chair, maybe kind of works on helping plan each meeting.
Sorry for having to step away. I had somebody ring the doorbell. That's how it goes. Well, I'm open to that, but if someone needs to volunteer, I would volunteer too, to make it easier and not have to go through some rotating thing.
Great. Thoughts, feedback on that now that we do have a nominee for sole chair? This is your decision, so please please weigh in. We need to, yeah, just hear what you all think about maybe having that sole chair rather than rotating model.
I think if Ian's willing, that's a amazing offer. And I'm also very curious what this emblem is that you're wearing, Ian. It's really beautiful on your neck. What is that?
It's a jaguar, and I got it in Colombia.
How about if Ian needs support, then we can have the alternate people step in and help with leading.
Great. See, is there a general consensus there then that Ian, well, we have to actually take a formal vote, but vote to have Ian be chair, and then other folks can kind of step in as they're available to kind of help plan the agenda. Okay, see nods. So we'll do a formal roll call vote. This is a state public body, so we want to kind of make sure that it's on the record. So I will just kind of call everyone's name in the order that I see them on whether you approve of Ian being the chair of the subcommittee. So Robin, you are first on my screen. So what is your vote?
I have to acknowledge that I was just checking. My kids are screaming, so I did not hear what.
Sorry, it's a vote. Do you vote yes or no on Ian being chair?
Oh yes, absolutely, and thank you, Ian.
Okay, great. Thanks, Robin. Yeah, we want to get done so folks can spend time with their kids. Tyson, what is your vote?
Yes, and thank you, Ian.
Michael?
Yes, and thank you, Ann.
Ian?
Yes.
Renee?
Yes.
And Megan?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ian, congratulations. You are the chair, and thank you again for volunteering. Will make it so much easier for us as staff to kind of have one point of contact. So, and then is there anyone else who kind of wants to volunteer if Ian needs help for planning the next meeting or to provide feedback with sort of extra time over the next month? Robin? Okay. So saw Robin's hand, Michael's thumb.
And Megan as
okay.
well, I heard, yeah.
Great. So we'll find a way to sort of coordinate and get ideas from everyone. But Ian, we'll go ahead with you as the chair and point of contact, especially for planning our next agenda and mapping out our timeline. So we'll be in touch soon. Okay, well, that was all we had for today. Does anyone have any closing thoughts or comments before we wrap up and kind of come back in a month?
Thank you for leading this first meeting and getting us started. Presentation was very helpful.
Thanks, Tyson. We really are excited to get to do this work with you. Any other thoughts?
I would just add that it's nice to get past the slides about procedural rules and to get into the work.
We are very excited about that too. All right, well, I think we can go ahead and wrap up then. So thank you all, and we will, yeah, see you all soon. So stay warm and stay safe and healthy.
Bye, be well.